Thank you very much for that very warm welcome. I'm hoping after last night's dinner that this is something that you can relax and kind of just enjoy the show. As I said, this is about how do you scan something on the scale of a blue whale? How do you process all that data, and then what do you do with it once you've got it? I think it's really important to understand that the Natural History Museum, the bit that you see as a member of the public, is our public outreach, basically. The rest of it goes on behind the scenes. There's 350 research scientists at the museum. We have currently over 200 postgraduate students doing PhDs and masters studies. We have hundreds of visiting researchers on an annual basis, and we have well over 2,000 research projects running on an annual basis as well. So this runs into dozens of international collaborations, and we are a global research hub, much more than you see as a member of the public, unfortunately. Natural History Museums contain an incredible variety of specimens. The sizes and the different types offer really difficult challenges for research and study. They can be incredibly delicate. They can be preserved in lots of different ways, and that itself brings its own challenges. And the Natural History Museum's collections are somewhere in the region of 80 million specimens, so enormous numbers of specimens to deal with as well. We have 4 scientific departments: Earth Science, Life Science. We have our Library and Information Services, and the part that I work for is the core research laboratories. And we have 18 members of staff. Most of us are educated to postdoctoral level, and we have a very wide range of disciplines covered in our team. There are about 60% of the museum's research comes to our labs, and there are 6 distinct laboratories, something in the region of 50 scientific instruments, and an annual investment from the museum in the region of 1.2 million. So just to give you a sort of quick snapshot of some of the sort of modern facilities that are tucked away in that amazing Victorian building. And how do we get there from the origins of the British Museum? So the British Museum was founded by Sir Hans Sloane. The government purchased his collections and then created, using his original house, Montague House, which was eventually torn down to build the British Museum. And then as the collections expanded and outgrew that original site, we built a new museum in South Kensington in 1881. That was part of the legacy, if you like, of the Great Exhibition. And formally, we were renamed the Natural History Museum in 1992. So when I started at the museum, this is the sort of look to the museum. It was a very dated-looking building. The collections were not as well cared for as they could be. There were odd places where you would find specimens tucked away because there was nowhere else to put them. All of that has been hugely modernized in the last 10 or 20 years. And what we have now is an oral history of that in this book, if you're interested in it. But going back to the Victorian era, the 1880s, if you like, it was a very different time. You had Victoria on the throne. Albert had been dead for about 30 years when this story begins. The Wrigley's company was just founded, but rather than selling chewing gum, they were selling soap. Tesla was doing his experiments on electricity. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Sherlock Holmes appeared on the scene. And the expansion of the railway systems and global trade was in full flow. And in the middle of all this is the expansion of the interest of curios, if you like. So this is Barnum, P.T. Barnum. And in 1881, an extraordinary event happened in Ireland. A blue whale washed up on the shore. Now, although this was the era of whaling, blue whales were too fast to catch using the whaling ships that were in action at the time. So none of these people will ever have seen a creature like this before. And the whale was still alive when it washed up. It was eventually killed, and a local businessman bought the whole whale for £111 and then cut it up, sold the meat for pet food, sold the oil, sold the baleen to dressmakers. They're used for the hoops in Victorian dresses. And the skeleton was sold to the Natural History Museum. It took nearly 3 years to prepare and then was eventually transported to London. And in London, there was nowhere to put it. There was no one space in the museum large enough to display the whale. So it was stored in one of our many large storage areas for nearly 40 years. And then eventually, a new space was created in the mid-1930s, and the whale was brought out of storage, and the craftsmen and scientists started to assemble the skeleton, and eventually it was hoisted into position in the newly constructed Whale Hall, where it has been ever since. Underneath the whale is a replica, which is an attempt to show what a blue whale looked like. And again, the people who were working from this had never seen a blue whale in real life. They had some photographs, but there was no kind of marine photography. There was no, you couldn't take a film crew out and take it underwater, for example. So the model we have of the whale, although it was the best that could be made at the time, to modern eyes looks a bit fat, a bit short, but nevertheless, it's an iconic specimen in the museum, and it's been there for nearly 80 years. Now, in 2015, we made the somewhat controversial decision to reorganize the main hall of the museum. So we've removed our iconic dinosaur specimen, Dippy, and that's now touring the UK. It's just finished in Birmingham. Unfortunately, you've missed it if you hadn't seen it, but it's just gone to Ireland, to Belfast. That left us a space in the main hall, and the idea was to put something in the main hall that is not a cast. So Dippy is a cast, it's a plaster cast, not a real specimen. The whale is a real specimen, and we wanted something that spoke more to the conservation challenges that we face currently. So we were then faced with the challenge of removing this skeleton from this very crowded space, conserving it, and then at the same time making a detailed scientific record of what we have here. So the intention was not just to remove it, clean it, and put it somewhere else, but also to study it, to capture a full-scale digital replica of it at very high resolution, and make that data available for the research scientists of the future so that we could understand more about these incredible animals and their incredible adaptations. So if we look at how complicated that is to get in there and lay out all that scaffolding, and then we compare it to the situation 80 years before, where they were somewhat more casual about health and safety, it has to be said. We also had, the whale is regularly cleaned. All the specimens are regularly cleaned, but the top of the whale is very, very difficult to access. So they had nearly 80 years worth of dust and grime to remove. That was a challenge in its own right, several kilograms of dust, and we've kept that because it's an interesting record of the changing industrial pollution in London's air. There was an extensive program of protection and reinforcement where the staff went in and identified areas that were damaged and worked out how to temporarily reinforce them before we started taking the skeleton to pieces. And then the enormous task of removing the specimen began. As you can see, these are not small pieces. This is my colleague Lorraine here, and these are just the very small bones at the tip of the tail. And you can see how large they are, and we're not even up towards the vertebrae, further up towards the head. Everything is heavy. 2 or 3 people were required to move most of these pieces. And as we started to uncover the ways that the specimen was originally mounted, and we took apart all of this material here, all of this debris is the way the model makers created the pads between the bones in the spinal column. What we found was a treasure trove of little screwed up bits of newspaper and stuff like that that people had stuffed into it as part of the packing material. So this is a newspaper clipping from 1932 that was just squished in there. Cheaper washing. So this is a real time capsule. And even on the skull, we found this set of signatures. So these were the people who worked on the project, and it's dated February 1934. So the whale in its own right is a time capsule as well. When we came to start to remove it, the engineering challenges became apparent. We had a LiDAR scan taken from the galleries, and we used the LiDAR scan to help build some of the engineering fixtures that were required to handle this immense specimen, which is not just really, really heavy, but also very delicate. And in an extremely confined space in a building where we weren't sure whether we could actually make use of the ceiling joist to hoist it. And as you can see, absolutely enormous scale and very, very delicate and difficult working conditions. If you're interested in sort of following this story in a more interactive way, there's a very good section on the museum's website, and there's also a BBC documentary that you should be able to find on iPlayer. We're now back in the conservation stores. This is the store that you saw in one of the earlier photographs, now completely renovated. And this was the scale of the problem that we were faced with, that my team was faced with. How do we scan objects of this size at hundreds of microns precision, knowing that every one of those specimens is well over a metre across? We had most of the conservation took place in this rather lovely sort of open laboratory that members of the public could come and visit us and talk to us. We did some of the scanning in this space, and we did some of the scanning behind the scenes in our laboratories. And this was the first project, the first 3D scanning project that my team were faced with. We bought the kit earlier that year, trained on it, and then this was the first thing. So talk about a bit of hubris, really. You know, this first project was to scan the largest animal that's ever lived. This is me on the right here with one of the lower jaws, just to give you an idea of the scale of the thing, probably 3 or 4 meters long, 450 kilograms, that individual bone. My colleague Brett here, scanning one of the ribs. We bought 2 Creoform GoScan systems, and we bought a Faro arms as well. And these are the sorts of output that we're producing. We have high-resolution 3D models of the bones, which were individually available to researchers, and which we've also turned into an articulated model online as well. While we had Dippy off display, we were also able to scan that skull and one of the femurs, and you can see one of the whale vertebrae in the background there as well. So this is my colleague Kate carrying out the scan there. And if you want to see the reproduction that we made here, it's on the LPE stand. Back to another one of our large stores, and we're still faced with the problem of how do we get around this model, this object. It's about 4.5 meters long. There's not enough space in this store to work with it or to scan it. So we hired an aircraft hangar, and we had to move out some of the stuff stored in the hangar first. And then once we were in that space, we could start to reassemble this incredible jigsaw, and then start to look at how we were going to scan it. So we worked with Measurement Solutions. They came in, they did a photogrammetry scan to get to work out how best to handle this. You can see some of their orientation markers on the frame there. And then they came in and fully laser scanned the whole skull and the lower jaws and some of the larger elements with their Metroscan system. You can see it involved a lot of climbing around, getting up close with this specimen. And then what we ended up with was these beautiful renders, really lovely quality renders of something that we could never have done on our own. So working in partnership for the museum has always been a really important factor for us. with this part of the whale skeleton complete, we knew that we'd solved the biggest challenge that we were going to have. The whale was intended to be re-exhibited with a new pose, much more dynamic than the previous pose, which kind of just looked like a stick. We didn't really know what whales looked like or how they behaved when that original pose was set up. And so we started modeling this with a 3D print made from our LiDAR scan and laying this out. So this is our museum carpenters built a quick replica of the main hall, and this is some of the team laying this out so that we could present this to some of the senior stakeholders at the museum. And you can see from these images here just how much more dynamic the pose is on the new armature. So rather than this very straight spine, we've got nice natural curvature to the spine. But fundamentally, the problems remain the same. You have very large objects, and you're climbing around them with step ladders. It's guys in boiler suits. So very similar images, really. Finally, with all the armature finished, the armature was built for us in Canada, flown over, and it was only when everything was laid out on the floor in the main hall that we could see how well this jigsaw was going to fit together. And you can see in pictures like this just how large this specimen is. These individual flippers are about 2.5 meters long. So the actual process of putting it back into the main hall involved yet more scaffolding. But you can start to see the very dynamic pose that we modeled in 3D as we were developing the new pose. And then you can see, the whole thing starts to come together. The new fixtures are basically, it's suspended from cables from the roof of the gallery. So we had to get special permission, and it was quite an engineering challenge as well to install these new mounting points in the gallery. We routinely LiDAR scan the whale to make sure that it hasn't moved and none of the cables have stretched or moved. And the final process of winching it into position involved this rather sort of manual process with all these guys hanging from the ceiling and just ratcheting the whole thing up into position. So this is the whale just as it starts to lift off the floor. And then you can see here how similar it is to our engineering model. So we were able to, as I said, model this in 3D so that we could start the process of moving it back into position. And if you remember, I showed you this image earlier from the original workers in 1934. Our team in 2017 also signed the whale. That's tucked away where you can't see it. And we're now starting to work on the research process. So while we had access to the specimen, we CT scanned some parts of it. The museum has a Nikon CT scanner. So we were able to get these lovely cross-sections from the CT scan. That tells us an awful lot about how these animals manage the forces in the tail. This is an enormous animal, and huge forces go through the tail as it swims. So this is one of the vertebrae from the tail. Again, a 3D render for you to look at there. And we have placed our digital surrogates online. So we have a number of specimens. They're available through Sketchfab, and you can download them. Researchers are asking for access to them. And we have a combination of an open process where some things you can just download, and a managed process where some of those specimens, they're too large to download directly, so people have to approach us to arrange for a secure transfer of the data. So just to sort of wrap up a little bit, this is a few of the vital statistics. The whale skeleton's 25 meters long. It weighs 4.5 tons. And we scanned 163 bones. The largest of those bones, the lower jaws, weigh around 450 kilograms each. So getting access to them and moving them around while we scanned was very, very challenging. But our 2 staff scanned that whole object, that whole whale, in just 6 weeks, with a resolution typically in the region of 200 microns. And then we spent 6 months processing the data. We have about 0.5 terabyte of storage just with whale data in it at the moment. And we achieved all of that with a budget of around 125,000. I'm very proud of the fact that we got that under budget. But the total project cost for the whale was around £2 million. So we had quite a small part of that, really. I'd just like to say this was a huge project. My role in it was very small. I was basically the procurement manager for the laser scanning equipment, but there were over 200 people who worked on the project. In my team, in the Imaging and Analysis Centre, I really have to give thanks to Kate Burton and Brett Clark, who scanned and processed all of the data. Our 3D visualization laboratory manager, Amy, who's in the audience today, and Farah Ahmed, who was the project manager in the laboratories. Measurement Solutions, I'd really like to thank Ian Cavill and Derek Lamb, Jason Bridge, for agreeing to help us scan the larger elements of the skeleton, and also Robert Greenbank, who's no longer at Faro, but Faro in general, for their support over the course of the project. And then we had great support at Sketchfab from Thomas Flynn. I'm going to bring the presentation to an end there. I did mention 3D printing on a large scale. If you do come to London, one of these flippers is a 3D print, but I'll leave you to try and guess which one when you come and visit. Thank you very much.